Chapter 18. I still wasn't happy with Raphael when we got to the gym at Mickey's, and I was giving him the silent treatment. It was a little childish, I know, but it was either ignore him or yell in frustration, and that wasn't the better option. Without a word, I waited for Gavin to get out of the old Bronco and hit the button, flipping his seat forward, giving me a place to get out. Climbing out of the back of a two-door SUV isn't the most graceful thing, and I was glad no one was around to see how badly I fumbled, tripping over the seat rails and nearly falling out and landing on my face on the ground. Closing the door, I shot the truck a dirty look and went in the converted barn we used as a gym. Inside wasn't quite warm yet, but the worst of the chill was gone, and I could take off the heavy coat Devin had pointedly handed me this morning. I guess he wanted to be sure I wore a warm enough jacket to suit him. I hung up my hat and coat and turned around, trying to decide what first. Deciding the best option was to warm up first, I moved onto the mat covering most of the floor on one half of the huge space and got started. The door opened again and I looked up. Mickey stepped in the door, his shoulders hunched and head down against the cold. "What's it like in here?" he asked, taking off his jacket. "Not too bad, but it could be warmer. I'll set it to start earlier tomorrow." He hung his jacket on one of the hooks and turned back to the room. Now that Mickey and Gavin were both present, Raphael met my gaze, nodded once, and left. He'd done his job by seeing that I safely arrived and in the hands of my guards. "See you tonight," I called after him. He waved one hand over his shoulder as he went out the door. I shook my head and continued with my stretches, focusing on the pull and stretch of each muscle before moving on to the next. Before long, Mickey joined me on the mat, stretching so he wouldn't get hurt either. I planned to give him a run for his money. He'd be glad he took the time to warm his muscles later. Finishing my warm-ups, I stood and looked around. I'd heard the door open a couple times and noticed a couple of men coming in, but not as many as there were now in the room. "It always this busy here this time of day?" I asked Mickey. He looked up and glanced around the room. There were several men using the machines on the other half of the room and a couple on another corner of the mat. "Looks about normal to me." "Are you usually here this time of day?" He gave me a wry smile. "Yep, every morning." "Well, at least you aren't having to get up early for me." I yawned. "But it is early for you," he said. "Yep. I can do early, it's the cold I don't care for." "Is that why you keep forgetting a warm coat?" "I wore one this morning. Besides, I live in Arizona for a reason, it's not supposed to get that cold." Mickey laughed. "But it does get cold, you need to face it and stay warm or you're gonna drive that mate of yours to distraction." He stood. "Probably. You ready?" I nodded. "All right then, let's start with what we went over last time." Without waiting for me to respond, he rushed me. I took his arm and spun, flipping him over my shoulder in one swift move, but instead of following up with an attack on the floor, I stood over him, looking down. "I thought we were going to go over it again." "I've no doubt you've got that move down." He rolled and got to his feet. "Now, I want you to come at me, remember how you're supposed to counter that move." He got into position and I went for him, but instead of letting him try to flip me like I'd done to him, I changed direction at the last second and used his readiness to flip me as the perfect distraction to change direction. I used my forward momentum and pushed down on his back, causing him to lose balance and fall forward onto his face. I danced around one side of his curled body and kicked him several times, careful to just touch him and not use my full strength. I kicked him in the ribs several times until he rolled onto his side, then danced around behind him and touched his lower back to one side of his spine. If the blows had been real, they would have, at minimum, bruised his kidneys. Most people would be hurting and pissing blood for weeks. I didn't want to hurt him, so I was only touching him, not kicking full strength like I would if I were actually fighting. Once I'd landed enough blows that a normal person, even a shifter, wouldn't be getting up soon, I backed off and let Mickey get to his feet. offering one hand to help him. "Where'd you learn that move, girl?" he asked, impressed. I shrugged. "It just occurred to me as you bent." His brows shot up, surprise clear on his face. "You came up with that on the spur of the moment?" "Yep." I danced in place, moving to keep my muscles loose. My brain was fully awake. Adrenaline pumping through my body made me happy and full of energy. I was ready for anything. "Want to try it with someone a little bigger?" Mike Harwitz stepped closer. Mike was tall, more than 6 inches taller than me and nearly that taller than Raphael. He was muscular but not bulky or heavy. Looking at him, I guessed he had at least 50 pounds on me. Fighting him would be more like what I would be dealing with if I had to go against another male shifter. Not that Mickey wasn't a good workout, he could hold his own against Mike, I had no doubt. But sometimes I wondered if he might be holding back, not making me fight his full strength. I looked around and noticed that most of the men in the room had stopped their own exercising and were standing along the edges of the mat, watching us. Sure, I swung my arms, one at a time in big circles, rolling the bone in the joint, as if I was going to be in a fist fight. "Why not?" "I'm not sure." Gavin tried to stop it. "Don't worry, I'll go easy on her." Mike took Mickey's spot across from me. I'd seen Mike fight before. He was one of the 2 men Devin had to fight in order to make it onto the enforcer team. I couldn't use the same moves again, he'd just seen them and he'd be prepared for that. I didn't have a plan, but sometimes that's what worked the best. "It's not her I'm worried about," Gavin muttered. A couple of the men caught the comment and shot him confused looks. Mike wasn't one of them. He twisted his neck in one direction then the other, deep cracks and pops sounding at either side. He crouched, facing me with his knees slightly bent, and beckoned me forward with one hand. I moved slowly first to one side, then the other, watching the way he moved. More than once I would jerk my body as if I was diving at him, but not. I was gauging his reaction time. After several minutes, Mike got impatient. He started waving the fingers of both hands in a come-hither motion. "She's messing with ya, man," Mickey called from the sidelines. Mike flinched, his eyes flicking to the crowd. It was an amateur move, and I took advantage of it. Charging forward, I folded my arm so my elbow protruded to one side and hooked one foot behind his, shoving hard and knocking him onto his back. Grabbing his shirt with the other hand, letting his momentum pull me down with him. As we fell, I pulled one leg up until when we landed, my weight drove my knee into his sternum, driving the air from his lungs. Again, I made my blows without putting any strength behind them. I touched the heel of my hand to the point of his chin. If I'd used any power, the blow would at the very least make his eyes water, at best broken his jaw. With the other hand, I touched his nose with a fist, then rolled off him and stood, stepping away from the downed man. Mike coughed and rolled to one side, pushing himself to his hands and knees, then to his feet. "Who?" he coughed again. "Who taught you to fight?" "My brothers." He lifted one brow. "Well, they weren't trying to teach me to fight per se, at least not in the beginning." "You fought with your brothers?" he frowned. "Of course, who didn't fight with their siblings growing up?" I laughed, and several of the men nodded and laughed. "Well, of course I fought with my brothers, but my sisters didn't fight with us, at least not like that. They'd yell, scratch, pull hair and throw things." I laughed again. "I was not your typical girl." "I bet not. The Theron's a lucky man." "I'm not sure why you consider him lucky just because I kicked your ass." I gave him a half-disgusted look as I turned away, twisting my neck. That was something I'd never understood. Why was the man lucky if their mate had some feature, skill, or personality quirk that another man found attractive? "You didn't kick my ass," he muttered. "Only because she tempered her blows. If she'd made every blow full strength like most of us do, you'd be on the floor and hurting for a while," Mickey said. "Why'd you do that?" Gavin asked me. I looked at him, confused. I'm here to learn to defend myself, not because I have to prove I'm bigger and badder. I don't need to hurt anyone to learn how to use different moves and how to counter them. But not using your strength doesn't teach you how to temper it either, and that's something we're supposed to make sure you can do. I look down then back up at him. I'll give you that. I'll even say I want to learn to fight without using my full strength, but not while learning new moves, and not against anyone who doesn't know the whole score. I'm not going to risk hurting someone that badly without them knowing what they're getting into. I looked away. The group that had gathered to watch Mike and I was dispersing, the men going back to what they'd been doing, working out on the machines or with each other. Personally, I'd prefer to do that with someone who heals quickly. I'd hate to do more damage than I intended, and someone be hurting for a while, simply because they heal slower than others. He looked at me wide-eyed for just a moment, then nodded and turned away. Nickie came up behind me. Come on over here and work with me a little bit. I followed, and he had me repeat the moves I'd made, both with him and with Mike several times, showing me different ways to block them and ways to get around them. We went over it all several times more. I don't know how long had passed when a sharp whistle caught my attention. I looked around and Gavin caught my eye, then tapped a finger against one wrist. I think that's our cue to wrap it up. Nickie said. I'll check in with him while you cool down. He straightened and went to the other man, leaving me to work my way through my stretches again.